Romania is going through a period of unprecedented political turmoil. The country, usually far from the European spotlight, is now on everybody's minds. But what are the real risks it is facing? And who's responsible for these shakeups? Good evening, my name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wider View. Our main story tonight focuses on Romanian politics. Between November 24 and December 8, Romanians were scheduled to go to the polls up to 3 times. But in the end, that's not what happened. And not because citizens lost interest in democracy or their country's politics. The final act of the electoral marathon, the presidential runoff, was cancelled just 2 days before the vote. It was an unprecedented decision for a country that's both a member of NATO and the European Union. The outgoing president, Klaus Iohannis, moved to postpone the ballot and voided the results of the first round, citing security concerns and foreign interference. So, what is really going on in Romanian politics right now? We map out the key issues in our first report.
On November 24th, over 9 million Romanians went to cast their ballots in the first round of the presidential election. That number by itself was concerning, as it marked the second lowest turnout since Romania's transition to democracy in 1989. But the big surprise came later that day, when preliminary results were announced. The 62-year-old Calin Georgescu, a former sustainable development consultant, emerged victorious with nearly a quarter of the vote. His triumph came as a shock to many observers, both domestically and internationally. Georgescu, a right-wing conspiracy theorist and NATO skeptic, hadn't even made the long list of frontrunners in the run-up to the election. Even Romania's far right was more invested in promoting 38-year-old George Simion, an outspoken admirer of Donald Trump. But Georgescu managed to rally enormous support through an impressive online campaign. He ignored mainstream media completely and didn't appear at any of the candidate debates. Instead, he focused on social media platforms, where his controversial videos were seen by millions. His message centered on criticizing NATO and the EU, questioning modern medicine, and dismissing democratic institutions as unnecessary. Georgescu also claims to be a devout Christian and promised to strengthen ties between the Romanian state and the country's Orthodox Church. His opponent in the runoff was supposed to be Elena Lasconi, a former international reporter turned liberal politician. But the vote was cancelled after security agencies revealed evidence of foreign interference in the first round. The date of the repeat vote has not yet been announced.
How could a relatively obscure candidate build an election-winning campaign in just a matter of weeks? Who's really behind Calin Georgescu? And what do Romanian elections tell us about the state of modern-day democratic politics? Romania right now offers a lot of questions and very few answers. But the guests on our show today will help us find more of the latter. And I'm pleased to say, joining me tonight are Professor Weronika Angel from the European University Institute in Florence and Professor Vladimir Tishmenianu from the University of Maryland. Good evening both and welcome to Wider View. And I wanted to begin with you, Weronika, and let's start with the latest. So December 4th, last Friday, the outgoing president, Klaus Iohannis, decided to disclose the report produced by the domestic security services, citing foreign interference and cancelling the results of the first round of the presidential ballot. Could you tell us what was in those documents that prompted the decision to nullify the result of the elections?
Thank you for the question and for the interest in this actually highly controversial decision that the Romanian authorities have taken. In fact, the court reversed its prior certification of the elections following revelations of foreign meddling to support this presidential candidate, specifically Calin Georgescu. This declassified intelligence report from the Supreme Council of National Defense highlighted striking similarities between his highly sophisticated social media strategy that you referred to and some online influence operations that we've seen in Ukraine before Russia's 2022 invasion, and concluded that the interference of a state-like actor in launching this campaign, as well as about 85,000 cyber attacks against electoral infrastructure, has contributed decisively to the rise of Calin Georgescu in the polls. And as a result, the court has decided to create the opportunity for a rerun, and hopefully one in which Russian meddling will be better taken care of by the Romanian authorities that have, for this round, shown significant weakness.
So a quick follow-up question, jumping on what you said. Do we know any more details about that foreign interference? Because you've mentioned Russian actors, and this is the hypothesis that's been highly reputable and circulated among international media. But has anybody been mentioned specifically in those reports as actors of influence, whether they were Russians or perhaps domestic actors inspired by Russians? Do we know anything more about the perpetrators of that strategy?
So the Romanian intelligence service, on who's reporting this declassified intelligence information is based, only refers to a state-like actor without mentioning Russia specifically. And it also reports there are about 25,000 TikTok accounts linked to Calin Georgescu's campaign that became highly active about 2 weeks before the first presidential election round, showing exceptional organization and a significant rise in followers. And this intelligence service also identifies about 1 million euros mobilized for the campaign, including very specific person in Georgescu's entourage who paid TikTok about $381,000, which is money confirmed by the platform. So what's happening right now since the revelation is that prosecutors from the Directorate for Investigating Organized Crime and Terrorism open a criminal case targeting Calin Georgescu's campaign and all the people around him. So we will know more precisely who are the people involved, including arrests of his head of security, as these investigations gather more information and more
steam. Certainly more to be investigated on that front, but let's move away from the news and focus on the bigger picture with you, Vladimir. The main accusations center around the campaign of Calin Georgescu, as Veronica pointed out. He's a 62-year-old former international institutions consultant, very much skeptic of anything that relates to modernity. But if you were to explain to me and to our audience, who is he politically? What is he on about in terms of his platform?
First of all, thank you very much for having me here. You mentioned earlier that this is a very, what were the term you said, this is a very interesting and I would say also a little bit depressing moment. And we are 35 years since the events that led to Ceausescu's downfall happened in Romania. And I made myself quite a lot of non-friends in Romania in early 1990, February, actually, when I published an article in the New Republic with the title New Masks, Old Faces. And Mateusz, I have rarely in my life had such a sentiment of deja vu that I've seen recently with what's going on in Romania. Now, who is Călin Georgescu? Călin Georgescu, first of all, has to be is a close ally of a movement which is called AUR, the Alliance for the Unity of the Romanians. AUR got into the parliament and is in the parliament because in the parliamentary elections, they got quite a lot of votes. Nobody talks about AUR anymore as it had disappeared somewhere in a memory hole. That's one thing. Second, the idea that this was a foreign arranged, masterminded, etc., obviously, the Russians want to have influence in Romania. Obviously, there was a Sputnik edition for Romania. It was a Sputnik edition for Poland. The Sputnik, this is the Russian publication. Obviously, there was Russian propaganda. But that doesn't mean that the source or the cause of what happened is exogenous, and actually it is endogenous. So I'm running against the whole interpretation of this as being something that was, Moscow. I have a whole book about Putin and violence and the myths and the propaganda and so on. But this is not something which is Moscow rooted. It is not the Kremlin. These are the Romanian secret services competing with each other like they did in December 1989. And it shows that it's a kind of charade. It's a kind of mirage. Who is Călin Georgescu? First of all, Aur, that I mentioned before, 3 years ago came with the name of Calin Georgescu as their candidate for prime minister.
I'm going to interrupt you here for a second, Vladimir, and actually press you on one thing, because you've mentioned AUR. But correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understood correctly, Georgescu was a member of that movement, but he wasn't running as candidate of that particular political formation in this election. And in fact, that movement...
It's called division of labor. It's called division of labor, okay? Georgescu and Simion. Now, look at the meetings. You have the Iron Guardists. Now, this is again, the classic, since it's, the reference to Marx, whatever. The first time it was tragedy, now it's farce. In December 1989, it was tragedy. 1,000 people died. Where are the people? I mean, they found this guy, the mercenary. Oh, do you have stories with mercenaries, with gurus, with stunts from movies, and you name it. I have a feeling that somebody must laugh a lot about all this. And people are scared because it was a state-induced sense of desperation, a state-induced sense of uncertainty. I thought the other day...
That's certainly, Vladimir, not necessarily a laughing matter for us, because we take that issue extremely seriously. Thank you, both of you, for the concise analysis of what happened during the first ballot and the campaign that preceded it. But we all know that the major shifts in Romanian politics started way before November of 2024. So let's take a deeper look into that contextual analysis right now. In between the first and the second round of the presidential vote, Romanians also elected their new government. Issues like support for Ukraine, the presence of foreign troops in the country, and the post-pandemic recovery were all on the ballot. But the election also revealed eroding support for mainstream parties. Our second report explores the dynamics among the key players in Romanian politics.
The parliamentary elections held on December 1st did not produce a working majority. The ruling Social Democratic Party came first, but received only 22% of the vote. It was followed by the Alliance for the Union of Romanians, a right-wing populist party formed only in 2019. Its leader, George Simion, was expected to fight for the presidency, but came only fourth a week before. His style of politics is inspired by the Donald Trump brand, a mixture of strongman rhetoric and anti-establishment claims. Simion's party ran on a platform of fighting for the interests of everyday Romanians, especially their economic concerns. It capitalized on voters' dissatisfaction with mainstream politics and government inefficiency. In one campaign stunt, the alliance built houses for victims of this summer's flooding. Later, the party officials organized a photo op with the victims, dressed in the alliance's colors. But its populism isn't limited to domestic issues. Simion argues that the West has been taking advantage of Romania since its EU accession in 2007. In his view, the country has been turned into a Western colony, providing cheap labor and resources. He points to the mass exodus of Romanians, especially young people who have moved to other EU countries in recent years. But this election also saw the emergence of a slew of new actors, such as the Party of Young People and SOS Romania. Together with Simion's party, they mark a decisive shift to the right in one of NATO's key strategic countries.
So, Veronica, I want to start the second part of our discussion with you again. And if we put together the results of the nullified presidential ballot and also the prime ministerial race, the parliamentary elections, we see a very clear right-wing, sovereignist, pretty much anti-Western turn in Romanian politics, with a number of different actors playing different roles. Where does this shift come from?
Well, indeed, to put a number to it, the far right has now 35% of the seats in parliament, which means that they practically tripled their presence in the Romanian parliament. However, what we call the pro-European, pro-NATO coalition of the remaining parties that start from the Social Democrats to the National Liberals to the Save Romania Union and the Union of the Hungarians, they are more of a coalition of need rather than a coalition around specific ideas. The Social Democrat Party actually shares a lot of their ideology with the members of the nationalist, further to the right spectrum. And many of their voters have, in fact, shifted to increase these numbers in the far right. As Vladimir said a few minutes ago, the amplification of Călin Georgescu's and ours message by foreign forces can only take us so far in the explanation. In fact, this is an overdetermined outcome that we can also see in the polls that we constantly take at the what Romanians want. And as you said, this is a protest vote against the mainstream parties. And also it is an answer to many of the things that the mainstream parties have left really in the dark, such as why Romania needs to support Ukraine. Romania is part of the group with the lowest support for Ukraine in Europe, together with Bulgaria and Slovakia and Hungary, which is not something that we talk about. And the mainstream parties have not really explained why Ukraine matters, why supporting Ukraine matters, why Romania's role in NATO is very important. So that's the second reason. So you mentioned economic reasons. Romania has had this important growth, but as a member of the European Union, but that growth has not led to equal distribution in the society. So the economy protest vote, the fact that the far right speaks about neutrality in a way that nobody fights them, and of course the fact that the far right grew on this anti-vax conspiracy theory sentiment. And it's important to note that also Romania, together with Bulgaria, is the lowest ranking in the COVID-19 vaccine intake. So all of these things together, plus many other toxic elements, have led to the rise of the far right in the last years. But nothing is more important than the fact that the mainstream parties, the Social Democrats and the National Liberals, who have been governing together for a long period of time, have in fact not delivered much when it comes to the status of Romanian, both domestically as well as in the diaspora. Because the Romanians outside the country have also shifted their preferences much more towards the far right than in the past.
And obviously, Romania isn't the only country in Europe experiencing that profound dissatisfaction of voters with mainstream parties. But to what extent is that something new to the Romanian society? And that's a question I'm going to direct to you, Vladimir. Is this a phenomenon that's actually completely new, or perhaps it is deeply rooted in Romanian society? And that very much touches upon my second question. How do Romanians perceive themselves in the European Union vis-à-vis the rest of Europe? And has this had anything to do with the results of the recent elections?
Wow, there's a whole dissertation here, but let me try to be very brief. First of all, Romania has a unique component in these elections because neither the National Front in France or whoever you want to find in Poland, which would be the equivalent, any of these groups do not mean a return to fascism. What we have with these movements, especially with George Simion and Georgescu, with his public admiration, statements of public admiration for whom? From Corneliu Zelea Codreanu, who was the guy who was murdered at the age of 39 in 1938 and was the commander-in-chief, the captain of the Iron Guard, the third largest fascist movement in Europe during the interwar period, with practice, the cult of violence, etc., the mystique of death and all the rest. And the other hero for Mr. Georgescu, the other hero is Marshal Ion Antonescu. So Le Pen and Le Penism is not a return. They don't say they want to go back to Pétain or to Jacques Doriot or whoever you want. Meloni doesn't say that she wants Mussolini back in the whatever palace in Rome. Well, these guys refer to it. To answer your second question, does ideology matters in this story much more, I think, than in the other cases? Maybe the one in Germany would be something close, but even that can be discussed, although there are connections between Georgescu and far-right Alliance for Germany, whatever it's called, AFD, in Germany. But the other thing that has to be asked here, and my answer would be to that, I don't know, but I'm inclined to say no, the answer. Do Romanians really want to get out of Euro-Atlantic institutions and establish in their country a dictatorship? And my answer is no, I don't think so. And
well, that's a very optimistic note, at least
it's
in this part.
Based on a lot of analysis that nothing shows that Romanians want basically the destruction of democracy.
That's something very positive, Vladimir, to bounce off. And on that note, I'm going to come back to you, Veronica, and ask an auxiliary question to something that you've already mentioned, which is the issue of the Romanian diaspora, because it is a gigantic pool of voters, over 7 million Romanians residing in different countries all over the world. Traditionally, correct me if I'm wrong here, rather more inclined to vote for pro-Western and pro-liberal movements. So what happened now that the young Romanians residing in Spain or Portugal or France actually turned their votes into the favors of Calin Georgescu?
As well as in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Italy, where Romania has a sizable diaspora. I think, again, we really need to study this phenomena to have clear measurements of what caused this movement. But I think that some of the hypotheses that we could test is definitely the fact that Romanian diaspora is very diverse. It's shown that particularly those who are employed in more precarious positions have been very responsive to the kind of offer that is coming from these parties. Second, our particularly has a very good organization outside the country. There have been quite a few studies about the strength of their institutionalized connections with the people. Third, there is a sensation that I think is now quite rampant also in Western society. So I mentioned Italy, Austria, the Netherlands, that the elites in these very countries as well have normalized far-right positions and anti-European positions. And it's quite likely that these people who are the Romanians who live in this country can now say, okay, so we can say these things. So it's acceptable to be anti-European as well. And then I think very important, the diaspora has not been paid attention to again by the mainstream party. So there is this sensation of having been forgotten, left behind, and there's a sentiment of anger that has really distributed among this group of people. Absolutely. Because they have to leave the country and they don't really see a way to come back.
And I guess, again, Romania is not being the unique country experiencing that kind of problem. I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. So we know that for certain the political future of Romania still hangs in the balance, and we will be keeping an eye on the further developments in the country. Professor Veronica Angel and Professor Vladimir Tishmelianu were our guests tonight. Thank you for being with us. The Romanian political shake-up comes at the end of a year with no shortage of turbulence in European politics. But this one is particularly important due to its international implications. As support for the Ukrainian cause fades, the West cannot afford to lose another member of its anti-Moscow coalition. And that's exactly what could happen when the dust settles on Romania's chaotic elections. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we will take a look at whatever's left of the Wagner Group and who the other Russian mercenary groups are. Make sure you're with us next week, and have a good evening.